She learned to breathe shallowly, not out of fear of being heard, not as a rule, out of economy. Each breath seemed to steal something that the body no longer had in abundance. The air went in and out as if it were too heavy, as if it had to be carried inside her chest before returning to the world. And the world returned the same, cold, a cold that didn't arrive suddenly. It was already there when she opened her eyes, as if it had spent the whole night sitting beside her, patiently waiting. The female body was curled up in a way that only a body that has lost the right to stretch learns to do. Shoulders hunched in, arms close to the torso, hands hidden, not out of shame, but because exposed fingers don't last as long. The skin seemed thinner where the fabric touched. The clothing itself offered no protection. It only reminded her that there was a layer between her and the world, and even then the world passed through. The cold had a name for her. Not a spoken name, but a recognized one, as if it was someone who had returned before. She didn't need to see snow to know. She didn't need wind. She didn't need a grey sky. Her body identified it on its own in advance. In the same way recognizes an old pain before the first stab. It was that cold, the one that doesn't end when the sun appears, the one that stays inside the wood, inside the metal, inside the walls, the one that enters the mouth when one tries to speak. The memory of the previous winter didn't come as a recollection. It came as a reflection. The mind was still trying to understand where it was, but the body already knew what was coming. The stiffness in the neck, the feeling that the nape of the neck never warmed up, the thighs pressed together to leave no space, and beneath all that, a thoughtless certainty. It's not just the atmosphere, its presence, its method, it's the way the place works. She looked without raising her head. The slightest movement to gauge the space, the slightest movement so as not to draw attention. Around her, other bodies had the same reduced form, the same care for the air, the same silence. It wasn't the tranquil silence of people resting. It was the silence of those who know they won't receive an answer. Silence as a warning, like an invisible sign saying that questions are useless there. Something about the place made it seem like everything had already been decided before she arrived. The floor felt cold even through shoes. Each footstep was a reminder. The metal, when it appeared, gleamed indifferently. The wood had a damp smell that wasn't the smell of home. It smelled of something that wouldn't dry out. Somewhere in the distance, there was a low sound of dragging, a tapping, perhaps a gate, but no sound came close enough to become a conversation. The space didn't allow human things to approach. It was too large or too empty, and the absence of explanation was part of it, as if it were just another element of the environment, along with the dampness and the dim light. She stood there, motionless on the outside, feeling her body expend strength on the inside just to continue existing. It wasn't the first time she'd been cold. She already knew that. What her body feared wasn't the cold itself, it was what came with it. The way it slowed everything down, the way it made her skin ache without a wound, the way it made the world seem even more distant. And worst of all, the way the cold transformed time into something solid, heavy, impossible to push away. The previous winter had taught us that the cold doesn't ask permission. It comes in, settles in, and then decides when to leave. She tried to remember what she did when there were still small choices, rubbing her hands, tapping her feet, blowing her own breath on her fingers. The memory came with a kind of shame, as if those old solutions were too childish for who she was now. There, any movement seemed large. Any attempt at comfort seemed to draw attention that wasn't safe to attract. Even the trembling had to be contained, not out of pride, but because trembling before armed strangers wasn't just weakness, it was exposure. She held her breath for a moment, without realizing it. Then she released it slowly, like someone returning a fragile object. The cold remained. It remained in the space between the ribs. It remained at the bottom of the empty stomach. It remained in the bones, where it's no use pressing with your hands. And it remained in the silence, which seemed to accompany each thought before it was fully formed, as if the place listened to intentions, as if even hope was something that needed to be hidden. She didn't know what was going to happen, but her body was already preparing itself as if it did. And that was the hardest part. The memory would return before the pain. The warning would come before the blow. The cold would come first, always first, as if to say, without words, that nothing would be explained. The body began to behave before any thought had even begun to form. It wasn't a decision. It was an automatic, almost polite adjustment. The muscles tensed just enough to avoid appearing too rigid. The knees didn't lock, but they didn't relax either. The weight was carefully distributed, as if the ground might punish an imbalance. The body was making silent calculations that the mind hadn't yet had time to process. She knew, not as one knows information, but as one knows an old pain. The cold wasn't there simply because it was winter. It was used, applied, maintained. There was a logic behind that prolonged exposure, and that logic didn't need to be announced to work. The body recognized methods even when no one named them. There were no orders at that moment, and yet everything seemed orderly. The tremor began small, almost politely, an internal restrained movement, as if asking permission to exist. She tried to hold it back, not out of bravery, but because trembling draws attention, and attention there was a risk without a defined form. The kind of risk that doesn't come with a warning, doesn't come with an explanation, doesn't come with a deadline. It only happens when someone decides it has happened. Her eyes remained lowered, not exactly on the ground, but on some neutral point, devoid of meaning. Looking directly at someone armed wasn't a challenge, but it wasn't safe either. Her body had learned this detail in another winter, a lesson that didn't come with words, only with consequences. Avoiding eye contact wasn't conscious submission. It was an attempt to go unnoticed, to become part of the scenery. Like the cold bench or the damp wall, fear didn't appear as panic. It spread as something more functional. It was a fear that organized gestures, that chose the moment to swallow hard, that determined the speed of breathing. A fear that didn't scream, didn't run, didn't beg. It simply stayed, present, operating. There was shame in the trembling, not a moral shame, but a physical one. Her body failing to remain intact before strangers who observed without needing to show anything. The simple act of feeling cold became an exposure. Goosebumps, stiff hands, shoulders rising slightly too much with each breath. All of this said something she preferred not to say. She tried to convince herself that resisting would help, to toughen up, to stand firm. But that idea didn't hold up for long. Her body had already learned that resistance, in that context, only prolonged the exposure. The more you fight the cold, the more it seeps in. The more you try to maintain dignity through strength, the faster it is exhausted. Fear, then, changed form. It was no longer the fear of what was to come, but of how long it could last. Minutes became heavy blocks. Time didn't move forward. It accumulated, and the body felt each layer overlapping the previous one, making it harder to maintain any notion of beginning or end. She realized she was no longer waiting for a specific gesture, a word, a clear decision. She was waiting for something, anything, to break that continuity. Because while nothing was happening, everything was happening inside. The cold continued to work, the silence continued to observe, and the body continued to learn, unintentionally. Yet another lesson that would not be forgotten. The mind was still trying to name sensations. The body didn't need that. It already knew. The uniform appeared before the voice. Even when no one spoke, it already said enough. The heavy fabric, the repeated color, the way it occupied space. No one needed to approach for the body to react. It was enough to know they were there. The presence of authority came unannounced, like the cold. And like the cold, it didn't ask for permission. At some point in the recent past, her body had made the connection, not as a clear thought, but as a silent chain of events. Uniform meant order. Order meant waiting. Waiting meant exposure. And exposure, that winter, always ended the same way. Controlled abandonment. Suffering without witnesses. Pain without direct responsibility. The cold then ceased to be merely an environmental condition. It became a tool. No one needed to say it was punishment. The body understood. The body knew when something was deliberately left to happen. The absence of blankets. The unexplained delay. The prolonged stay outdoors. All of this communicated without words. And the uniform, motionless, made the message clearer than any shouting order. She kept her gaze lowered, not because anyone demanded it, but because she had learned that looking too long could transform an invisible body into a chosen one. And being chosen never meant anything better. The ground, even cold, was safer than a face. The emptiness was safer than a pair of eyes that could decide anything. There was a constant effort to downsize, reduce gestures, reduce the space occupied, reduce even one's own presence. Obedience didn't come from respect, but as an attempt to disappear enough to provoke nothing. It wasn't ideological submission. It was a survival strategy in a place where even the weather seemed to obey invisible orders. She realized she no longer expected justice, nor clarity. She expected predictability. If the cold came as indirect punishment, at least it made sense within the logic she had learned. What her body couldn't bear was the uncertainty. The idea that anything could happen for no reason at all. The uniform, at least, offered a simple, albeit cruel explanation. Someone had power, and that power didn't have to be kind. Winter began to have a face,
even without being confronted.
Each additional minute in that position reinforced the lesson.
Authority didn't mean care.
It meant control through omission.
It meant letting the cold do the work that no one wanted to take on directly.
The body, once again, learned unintentionally.
It learned that not asking was safer.
That not reacting was safer.
That accepting the cold as part of the system hurt less than waiting for something that might never come.
She stood there, her body adjusted to the bare minimum necessary to continue. The uniform remained, and now winter seemed even longer.
Nothing happened.
And yet, the body continued to react as if something was about to happen at any moment. Time ceased to move in a recognizable way. It didn't follow a straight line.
It piled up.
Each minute rested on top of the previous one, heavy, immobile, impossible to remove. There was no sign of transition, no command,
no change in the environment that indicated a beginning or an end.
Only permanence. And permanence in that place hurt more than any clear threat. She stood there long enough to call it a short wait, and too short a time to know if it was permanent.
Her body began to lose simple points of reference.
Her legs didn't exactly hurt, but they weren't well either.
It was a discomfort without a peak, widespread, constant. A feeling that her blood was circulating more slowly,
that her feet no longer fully belonged to the rest of her body. The mind remained alert, almost aggressively awake. Even as her body began to slump, something inside her refused to shut down.
Every distant sound seemed like a warning.
Every slight change in the air seemed to foreshadow a decision. The silence wasn't empty. It was active. It watched. It pressed. It reminded her, every second, that someone controlled that absence of events. The cold continued its patient work. There was no way to warm up while moving. There was no room to walk. There was no explicit permission, but there was also no need for prohibition.
The body knew how far it could go without crossing an invisible line.
It stayed still because staying still seemed less risky than attempting anything that could be interpreted as a deviation.
She felt her fingers lose precision.
Opening and closing her hand required attention. The simple act of bending her knees needed to be planned.
Her body was there, but it was beginning to function like something borrowed, responding with a delay. Still, her mind registered everything.
The contrast was cruel. Her body slowly giving up,
her mind forced to remain.
Silence became a form of control. Not explaining was part of the method. Not saying how long. Not saying why. Not saying what came next.
The absence of words kept everyone suspended in a continuous state of expectation, without any foothold.
When you don't know why, there's nothing to react against. All that's left is to endure.
She realized this without even formulating the entire sentence.
He realized it when he understood that he no longer expected answers. He only expected signs. A movement, a glance, anything that indicated that someone, somewhere, was still aware of the passage of time.
Because there, time seemed to have no value of its own. It was just another thing that could be taken away.
Nothing was happening. The body trembled less now, not because it felt better, but because it was tired. The cold was no longer sharp, but deep. A cold that doesn't bother you immediately, but that remains even when you try to ignore it. A cold that settles inside and changes the way the body recognizes itself. She understood at that point that waiting was not an interval between two events. The wait was the event. And while no one explained, it was because no one needed to explain.
The place functioned like that.
The silence was enough.
The cold was enough.
The stillness of time was enough. Everything they're taught without saying, controlled without touching, punished without declaring guilt. She remained motionless. The body is numb. The mind is awake. And the worst part wasn't not knowing what would come next. It was becoming clear that this was already the aftermath. There was a pause, not an announced pause, nor a clear interruption. It was more like a continuity error, too small to be immediately understood.
Something that didn't fit perfectly into the sequence the body already knew.
The silence continued. The cold continued. The position was the same.
Yet, there was a strange, almost imperceptible interval where the expected indifference was not complete.
She felt it before she saw it. The body perceived a shift in the air, a movement that didn't carry an immediate threat.
It wasn't a sudden approach. It wasn't haste. It wasn't the kind of gesture that usually precedes orders or corrections. It was something minor, discreet, an adjustment of presence that didn't require a response. For a moment, she thought she was mistaken. The body, accustomed to preparing for the worst, hesitated to register it as real.
The mind searched for quick explanations. Perhaps it was just someone passing by. Perhaps it was a delay before something worse. Perhaps it was the cold creating illusions. The fear of misinterpreting was greater than the curiosity.
Then came the gesture.
Too small to change the atmosphere, insufficient to truly warm things up.
A gesture that wasn't obligated to exist.
It didn't resolve the situation. It didn't explain anything. It wasn't accompanied by words that would organize the meaning of what was happening. Precisely for that reason, it was disorienting. She didn't know how to react. The body had no memory prepared for that.
There was no internal instruction to handle with care where carelessness was expected.
The hands remained where they were. The shoulders did not relax. The gaze did not immediately rise. It was too early to trust.
Too late to pretend nothing had happened. Confusion slowly set in.
It wasn't relief. Not yet.
It was a different kind of suspension, as if known logic had failed for a second and left an empty space in its place.
A dangerous space, because it contained possibilities, and possibilities in that context were almost as threatening as bad certainties.
She was afraid to believe it. Experience had taught that misplaced hope exacts a high price. The mind began to mount defenses, trying to lessen the impact of that moment.
Perhaps it had been automatic.
Perhaps it meant nothing.
Perhaps it wouldn't repeat itself. It was safer to think that way. Safer to keep the body closed off, prepared for the return of the familiar pattern.
The cold was still there.
The silence too. Nothing had actually changed. And yet, something was different. Not in the environment, but within her. A slight disorganization. A tiny crack in the predictable sequence of abandonment.
Her body, accustomed to enduring, now had to decide whether to ignore it or register it as an exception.
She chose not to decide. He remained motionless as before.
He breathed shallowly as before. He kept his gaze downcast as before.
But the gesture remained in his recent memory, insistent, out of place. A detail that didn't fit, and for that very reason, could not be forgotten.
Fear now had another layer.
It wasn't just the fear of what was to come. It was the fear that it might mean something. And in that place, meaning something was always dangerous. There was no announcement, no clear change of tone, no order that marked a transition. Yet, something shifted definitively. The logic that had hitherto organized each sensation began to fail. Not spectacularly, but like a gear that loses a tooth and continues to turn imperfectly. The authority was still there. That hadn't changed. The uniform remained the same. The cold too. The space remained harsh, indifferent, offering no real comfort. And yet, in that specific second, the cold ceased to be used.
Not because it had ended, but because it was not activated as a weapon. The absence of action became action. She realized this too late. Her body reacted first, as always.
Her shoulders slumped slightly before she allowed it.
Her breathing lengthened without asking her mind's permission. Her heart, which had been beating in a defensive, irregular rhythm, found a slightly different beat. None of this was conscious. It was an involuntary response to a threat that, for a moment, did not materialize.
The mind became suspicious. Accepting protection unconditionally seemed wrong, almost reckless.
Experience had taught her that every kindness demanded something later, that every relief came with a hidden cost.
She tried to remain rigid inside, even when her body began to respond differently. Trusting too soon was dangerous. Trusting without guarantees, even more so. But the body did not wait for authorization. He reacted to the relief before his mind could organize defenses.
The warmth didn't come from outside. It came from the reduction of tension, from the minimal release of energy that had previously been spent just to stay alert.
A small relief, almost imperceptible, but enough to cause strangeness. She felt something close to dignity return, not as an idea,
as a stance,
as the possibility of existing without being completely reduced to waiting. Nobody said anything. Nobody explained anything. Yet, something was returned without words. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't security. It was simply the silent recognition that, in that second, someone chose not to hurt when they could. The war there failed to follow its own script. Not because it had ended, but because someone interrupted the automatic process.
The choice was too small to be celebrated, too big to be ignored.
And precisely because it wasn't accompanied by any speech, it carried more weight than any declaration.
She stayed where she was. The cold was still there.
The silence too.
But now there was a difference that was hard to name.
It wasn't hope. It wasn't gratitude. It was the realization that logic wasn't absolute.
That, even in that scenario, there was still room for a human decision that didn't completely obey the system. The body preserved it.
She kept it without knowing why.
She kept it as one keeps something fragile hidden deep inside clothing, without knowing if there will be another time to use it.
Her mind remained cautious, but her body had already registered. Not all power chooses to hurt every time, and in that second when nothing was done against her, something inside her remained whole.
The cold weather persisted.
He didn't disappear with the gesture, nor with the choice that interrupted logic for a second.
The air remained sharp.
The ground continued to return the same rigidity to his feet. His body was still tired, worn out, far from any real comfort. Nothing there had concretely transformed, and yet, something resisted. It wasn't a clear memory, it was more like a fixed point.
Amidst days that blended into one another, that instant remained separate, intact, not because it had been great, but because it hadn't followed the rule.
The body remembered it as it remembers something improbable.
Something that shouldn't have happened, and precisely for that reason, didn't dissolve with time. She knew that winter would return, perhaps in a different way, perhaps in the same place, perhaps with the same strength.
The cold had not been overcome.
There was no promise that things would be different from then on. The world around her remained organized by the same harshness.
Decisions remained beyond her reach.
Nothing indicated lasting change, but absolute certainty had also failed.
Until then, the body had learned that all power chose to wound when it could.
That all authority used silence and atmosphere as an extension of its own strength.
That there were no deviations.
Only repetitions. That second had broken that continuity.
Not enough to create security, but enough to create memory.
Humanity, there, did not present itself as discourse.
It didn't come in comforting words. It didn't come in promises. It didn't come in explanations.
It appeared silently, just like the cold. But unlike the cold, it didn't occupy everything.
It simply stayed, small, present.
Enough to be carried without drawing attention.
She continued to exist in that space, with the body still alert.
With the mind still cautious. Nothing within her fully opened, nothing completely closed.
The experience didn't become explicit teaching.
It didn't become organized hope. It became something simpler and heavier. The awareness that not every gesture is predetermined. It was still cold, but he was no longer alone.
And in that scenario where almost everything served to reduce power, that detail silent, without witnesses, without a name, preserved something that could not be taken away later.
Not because it was protected forever, but because it was recognized only once.
That was enough to stay. Some people move on.
Others stay a little longer.
The stories continue here for those who choose to stay.
Pacific. What you out there? Yes, clear.